A single dawn can open a door you never knew stood waiting. For Maddie Clark, a young waitress carrying her mother's fragile past and her own unanswered questions, that moment began with a glimmer of gold. For Evan Merrick, heir to a coastal empire built on old money and older secrets, it was the first fracture in a legacy he had always trusted. She was simply trying to survive another stormy night at the Harbor Light Diner. He was just another traveler seeking coffee and shelter from the wind. But when she noticed the golden compass resting against his chest, a quiet spark inside her flared into something fierce and undeniable. A memory once soft and distant roared awake with the force of a rising tide. This is not a legend whispered by sailors at sea. This is the story of how an innocent comment in a small seaside diner set two destinies on a collision course and unearthed a truth a powerful family believed the ocean had swallowed forever. The coastal town of Windermere, tucked along the ragged shoreline of Maine, shivered under the weight of a violent nor'easter that had rolled in from the Atlantic. Windermere was a place where fog was a familiar neighbor and storms were old friends, the kind of town where the smell of salt clung to every wooden doorframe and the wind seemed to sing through rusted fishing net hooks. On this particular night, the rain slanted sideways in silver sheets, pelting the windows of Harbor Light Diner like impatient fingers demanding to be let in. It was close to 10 p.m., long past the dinner rush, and the storm outside felt like a wild creature pacing at the door. Inside, the diner glowed with a soft amber haze from the aging pendant lights that hung above each booth. Madison Clark, known to almost everyone simply as Maddie, stood behind the counter, wiping down a chrome surface that never truly stayed dry. Maddie was 27, a young American woman with pale skin dusted with faint freckles, soft chestnut brown hair usually tied in a low ponytail, and a tired but kind expression that seemed glued to her face no matter how difficult her shift was. She was of medium height with a lean frame shaped by years of working double shifts and eyes the color of wet earth, gentle, observant, and always carrying a quiet worry that few people recognized but everyone sensed. She had learned early to be careful with her hopes. Her mother's heart condition and perpetual medical bills had carved responsibility into her bones long before adulthood arrived. Tonight, exhaustion made her shoulders sag slightly, but she still moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago made peace with hard work. Near the window was the only other employee on duty, Carl Turner, the short-order cook. Carl was in his mid-40s, stout, balding, and always smelling faintly of onion rings. He was a man of simple pleasures, baseball on the radio, his old black Labrador waiting for him at home, and steaming mugs of bad diner coffee. Carl wasn't much of a talker, but he had a soft spot for Maddie ever since she'd covered 3 consecutive night shifts for him when his dog had surgery. He watched her quietly, making sure she didn't look too overwhelmed by the storm or the late hour. The bell above the door suddenly chimed sharp and delicate, almost out of place against the roar of the wind. Both Maddie and Carl looked up instinctively. A man stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of wet air and the faint smell of cedar and cold rain. Even in the dim diner lighting, he stood out as though he had been carved from a different world entirely. Evan Merrick, a name Maddie didn't know yet, but a presence impossible to ignore, walked in with the confident, measured stride of someone accustomed to boardrooms and international terminals rather than small-town diners. Evan was 33 tall, with a lean, athletic frame beneath a charcoal gray wool coat that looked far too expensive for a place like this. His face was sharply cut high cheekbones, a straight nose, a defined jawline shadowed by the faintest trace of stubble. His dark hair was swept back but damp from the storm, and his eyes, an arresting steel blue, held the cool detachment of someone who had seen the world bend to his decisions. He carried himself with a quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Maddie swallowed instinctively, straightening her posture. Customers like him didn't wander into Harbor Light Diner unless they were lost or fleeing something. The storm must have driven him inside. Evan surveyed the room, his expression unreadable, then chose a booth in the back corner, the one where the diner light flickered intermittently. He sat gracefully, removing his coat and revealing a crisp navy shirt beneath it. As he settled in a golden glint at his chest, caught Maddie's eye. When he leaned forward to rest his hands on the table, the object slid into view, a golden compass hanging from a thin, weather-worn chain. Maddie's breath hitched unexpectedly, a small gasp escaping before she could contain it. She recognized it. Or rather, she recognized its twin. The compass was round, slightly larger than a pocket watch, made of warm-hued gold with intricate, almost delicate engravings swirling over its surface. It bore a single cardinal emblem, a raised starburst in the center with a minute sapphire set at its core. It looked ancient, handcrafted, and impossibly familiar. Maddie had seen that same design every night of her life. At home in her mother's bedroom, in a small cedar box that smelled of lavender and dust, lay the only heirloom Nora Clark owned, a golden compass worn on the edges, identical in every line and curvature to the one resting against Evan Merrick's chest. Nora always claimed it was her father's last possession before he died, a final treasure from a man who lived his life at sea. Maddie had always believed the story, even though her mother spoke little about her past. She forced herself to breathe and walked toward Evan, grabbing a menu and her notepad. "Welcome to Harbor Light," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Can I get you something warm? The storm's brutal tonight." Evan didn't look at the menu. His gaze remained fixed on the rain streaking down the fogged window. "Coffee," he said calmly, his voice smooth, low, and carefully controlled. "Black." Maddie nodded and turned, but her eyes drifted again to the compass. She couldn't stop staring at it. She set the coffee cup in front of him, her hand brushing the table lightly. The compass shifted again, glinting in the diner's flickering light. The words slipped out without permission, shaped more by shock than intention. "My mother has one just like yours." Evan froze. Completely. As though someone had pressed pause on the world. For a long moment, he didn't move a muscle. Then he lifted his gaze, and Maddie felt the weight of his attention like a sudden drop in temperature. "I'm sorry," he asked the question, sharp but soft-edged, the way someone asks when they expect a lie. Maddie's face warmed. "The compass? My mother? She has one that looks the same. Every detail." She expected confusion, mild curiosity, maybe even amusement. But what she saw instead was shock quickly masked beneath an icy veneer. Evan straightened in his seat. "That's impossible." His tone was flat, void of uncertainty. Maddie blinked. Well, maybe it's a replica, or..." He cut her off. "There are no replicas." He touched the compass lightly, almost protectively. "This compass has been in the Merrick family for generations. Crafted in 1899 by a maritime artisan for my ancestor, Captain Elias Merrick. There is only one." Maddie felt embarrassment flood through her, followed quickly by something else, a dark, creeping question she couldn't quite form. "I'm not lying," she said quietly. Evan studied her with a sharp, evaluating stare. He seemed ready to dismiss her entirely, but the storm howled outside and the diner hummed with a strange quiet, as if the night itself refused to let him walk away from her words. "Where does your mother's compass come from?" he asked. "Her father," Maddie said. "It's the only thing she has of him." Evan exhaled slowly, as though physically grounding himself. "May I see it?" Maddie shook her head. "Not right now, but I can tonight." Evan's jaw tightened. He nodded once, curtly. The rest of his stay was brief. He finished half the coffee, left money on the table, and before stepping back into the storm, he looked at Maddie one last time with an expression that was difficult to decipher, suspicion mixed with something almost like fear. When he left, the diner felt colder. Carl approached her. "You okay, kid?" he asked. Maddie forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." But she wasn't okay. Not at all. When she returned home later that night, soaked by the freezing rain, she went straight to her mother's room. Nora was already asleep, her thin breaths slow and fragile. The cedar box rested beside the lamp. Mattie opened it with trembling fingers. The golden compass inside gleamed softly, illuminated by the warm lamplight. It was identical down to the starburst, engraving down to the tiny sapphire, down to the impossible age it seemed to carry. And a single thought struck Mattie so hard, her knees weakened. What if her family held something that never should have left the Merricks' hands? The storm outside raged as Mattie stared at the compass in her palm, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if her mother's past was built on a story that wasn't entirely true. Morning came to Windermere, wrapped in a thin veil of fog, the kind that softened edges and made the world appear as though it hadn't fully woken. The nor'easter had passed, but its ghost lingered in the damp chill that clung to every porch rail and pine needle. The streets were still wet, reflecting pale streaks of sunlight breaking through the clouds like hesitant promises. Mattie Clark walked home from her shift with the golden compass pressed tightly in her coat pocket, the metal warm from her touch. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the identical compass swinging from Evan Merrick's neck, gleaming in the dim diner light like a fragment of a story she was never meant to uncover. When she reached the small, weather-beaten house she shared with her mother, she hesitated at the front door. The truth felt too big and too sharp to carry alone. She found her mother, Nora Clark, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished cup of chamomile tea steaming weakly in front of her. Nora, always thin and delicate, looked even more fragile today. Her brown hair, threaded with gray, was pulled back in a loose braid. Her soft face carried decades of exhaustion, the kind that came not only from illness, but from tightly held secrets. Nora looked up with tired eyes that once held laughter, but now carried caution. "You're home early," she murmured, her voice rasped from a night of poor sleep. Mattie took a slow breath and sat across from her. "Mom, I need to ask you something." Nora's fingers tightened around the warm mug. "Mattie, sweetheart, whatever it is, it's about the compass." The muscles in Nora's jaw tensed almost imperceptibly, but Mattie saw it. "Your grandfather gave it to me," she said softly. "That's all?" Mattie shook her head. "I know that's not all." She reached into her pocket, placed the compass on the table, and let it rest there like a silent accusation. "A man came into the diner last night, Evan Merrick. He had the exact same compass, the exact same mom. He said his family's compass was the only one ever made." Nora's eyes darted away. "People say all kinds of things. Maybe he misunderstood." "He didn't," Mattie whispered. "Please, Mom, I'm not a child. Tell me the truth." Nora's shoulders sagged as though a weight she'd carried for decades had just become too heavy. But still she shook her head, her voice breaking. "It was a gift from my father. A gift, Mattie. That's all you need to know." Mattie recognized the tone, final, impenetrable, a wall built from fear. She also recognized the lie. "Mom, was he really your father?" Nora flinched, a tremor running through her fingers, but she forced a brittle smile. "Let it go, Mattie. Some stories bring nothing but pain." Mattie knew she would get nothing more today, but she also knew she couldn't let it go. Later that afternoon, with the fog lifting and the ocean wind rising, Mattie walked toward the Windermere Coast Rescue Outpost, perched on a bluff overlooking the turbulent waves. She needed help, not emotional guidance, but someone who could look at the compass without fear, someone practical, analytical. Caleb Morgan fit that perfectly. Caleb was 28, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sturdy build shaped by years of pulling stranded swimmers from rough waters. He had tanned skin, sandy blonde hair always tousled by sea spray, and green eyes that held quiet steadiness. Caleb was the kind of man who rarely panicked and rarely bragged. In high school, he had been the boy who asked if people got home safely, who volunteered for cleanup after storms, who smiled easily but spoke honestly. Life on the coast had honed his instincts into something sharp but gentle, a protector forged by salt and wind. Inside the outpost, he was sitting at a metal table repairing a torn rescue harness. He glanced up when Maddie walked in, immediately reading the tension in her shoulders. "Something's wrong," he said, setting his tools aside. "Bad night," Maddie handed him the compass. "I need you to look at this." Caleb turned the compass over in his large hands, tracing the engravings with a curiosity that sharpened into deeper focus. "This is old," he murmured. "Handcrafted. Beautiful." "There's more," Maddie said quietly. "Caleb, another man has one. Identical. He said this compass should be one of a kind." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "People make replicas." "Not this," Maddie insisted. "And he wasn't just anyone. It was Evan Merrick." Caleb let out a low whistle. The shipping family. The Merricks, who own half the boats in the county, Maddie nodded. He said his compass was made for Captain Elias Merrick and his son. Only one survived. Only one, Caleb repeated softly. Meaning the other was lost at sea, she finished. Caleb brought the compass closer to the desk lamp. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Maddie nodded. Caleb picked up a jeweler's loupe used for inspecting metal corrosion from wrecks. As he examined the backside of the compass, he froze. His breath tightened. "Maddie, look at this." Maddie leaned in. Beneath scratches and tarnish, barely visible under normal light, was an etched string of tiny numbers arranged with purposeful precision. "Coordinates," Caleb said. "Old ones. They're etched so faintly, it's like someone wanted them hidden, unless you were looking for them." Maddie's heart hammered. "Where do they point?" Caleb typed the numbers into the computer's mapping software. The screen blinked loaded, then zoomed in on a point several miles offshore, marked by a faded red icon. Caleb stared. "No way?" "What is it?" Maddie asked breathlessly. Caleb swallowed. "These coordinates match the site of the Merrick shipwreck. The North Star. It sank 40 years ago." Maddie stared at him, the world narrowing into a tight corridor around her. "My mother's compass came from a man she said was my grandfather. And that wreck," Caleb said gently. "There were rumors someone survived. A sailor pulled from the debris. But the company denied it. There were never any names. The implication struck like a tidal surge. "Caleb, are you saying my grandfather could have been a survivor?" Caleb finished. "Or someone who wasn't supposed to survive?" He held the compass carefully, respectfully, like an artifact rather than a trinket. "Maddie, if this compass came from that wreck, it might belong to someone the Merricks believed was gone forever." Maddie felt her pulse race. "Caleb, what if my grandfather never existed at all? What if he wasn't who Mom said he was?" Caleb exhaled slowly. "Then you just uncovered a piece of history someone wanted buried." Meanwhile, across town, the Merrick estate rose from the cliffs like a monument to old wealth. Evan Merrick stood in the dim temperature-controlled archive room deep in the west wing, surrounded by shelves of maritime logs journals and ancient ledgers. His jaw was tight, his steel blue eyes sharper than usual. He had come here immediately after leaving the diner, unable to shake the tremor in his chest when the waitress claimed her mother had the same compass he wore. He opened a leather-bound naval registry belonging to Captain Elias Merrick. Dust floated up in faint clouds as he turned the yellowed pages. And then he saw it, a single line written in elegant black ink, "The Golden Compass, given to Captain Elias Merrick and his son only. One lost at sea." Evan stared, the words twisting like a knot inside him. His father had told him stories of the Merrick lineage of heirlooms, of a single compass symbolizing the family legacy. Never once had he mentioned a second compass. "Why?" Evan whispered, did he never tell me? The silence in the archives swallowed his question whole, and in that silence, in two different parts of Windermere, two truths surfaced at the same time. Mattie stared at the compass in her hand as though it might speak. Evan stared at the ledger as though it had betrayed him, and both of them felt the same chilling realization someone was missing from both of their histories, someone who connected them in ways neither understood yet. Windermere was still wrapped in the damp breath of the ocean the next morning, the sky a pale washed-out blue that carried the scent of salt and distant storms. The streets glistened with leftover rainwater, and gulls circled above the harbor with their usual impatient cries. Mattie Clark walked home with the golden compass held tightly in her pocket, her mind running in frantic loops. She had barely slept after the discovery with Caleb. Every detail of the coordinates, every whispered possibility, pulsed through her thoughts like a heartbeat. She couldn't quiet. But one thing weighed heavier than all of it. She needed to confront Nora again, not with gentle questions this time, but with the truth. Inside the house, Nora Clark was dusting the small bookshelf in the living room, moving slowly, her motions careful and controlled. Nora was a thin woman whose past hardships clung to her in the way she walked, shoulders slightly hunched, breaths, shallow fingers trembling whenever she held something fragile. There was always a softness in her eyes, a lingering kindness shaped by years of caring for others despite her own failing health. But beneath that softness lay a fear Mattie had begun to recognize, a fear that seemed older than she was. "Mom," Mattie said quietly, entering the room. Nora turned. When she saw what Mattie held in her hands, not just one compass, but two, her face went sheet white. The color drained so quickly, Mattie barely had time to take a step forward before Nora's knees buckled. "Mom." Mattie lunged, catching her before she hit the floor. Nora's breaths came sharp in shallow panic, flashing across her features. Mattie guided her to the sofa, holding her mother's hands until the trembling subsided. Nora finally whispered, Where did you get the second one?" "A man had it," Mattie answered softly. "A Merrick. He said it was the only one. But he was wrong." Nora squeezed her eyes shut, her breath uneven. For a long moment she said nothing. When she opened her eyes again, Mattie saw at the moment a secret too heavy to carry finally cracked open. "This isn't from my father," Nora said in a trembling voice. "I lied to you." Mattie swallowed, her chest tightening. "Then who gave it to you?" Nora drew a long, shaking breath. "I was 8 years old. It was winter. I wandered too far up the coastline. The tide was rough that day. It dragged me under. I nearly drowned." Mattie's heart hammered. She had never heard this story. Nora continued. "A man pulled me out. A sailor, exhausted, barely able to stand. He was young, but looked old from hardship. Tan-skinned, salt-bleached hair, stubble on his jaw, and eyes that looked like they carried storms behind them. He wore a torn navy shirt, one sleeve ripped, and he had a limp in his right leg. His hands were warm but trembling, as if he hadn't rested in days." "What was his name?" Mattie asked. Nora shook her head slowly. "He never told me. I asked, but he only smiled a sad smile, like he'd lost more than he could bear. He wrapped me in his coat, carried me to the cliff path, and before he disappeared down the shore, he pressed this compass into my hand." Mattie looked down at the golden object, a relic, a riddle. "What did he say?" Nora's voice became barely a whisper. He said, "If this ever finds its twin, the truth will surface." A chill spread down Mattie's spine. "You never saw him again?" she asked. Nora shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "He disappeared into the fog. No one believed me when I told them a sailor saved me. They said there were no shipwrecks that week, no strangers reported on the coast. After a while, people thought it was a child's imagination. So I stopped talking about him." She squeezed Mattie's hand. But he saved me, and he gave me that compass. I kept it because it felt like the last piece of someone who didn't belong anywhere. Maddie felt the weight of it, not just the compass, but the legacy tied to it. So the man who gave you this, he wasn't your father. No, Nora whispered. I don't know who he was. I thought he might be an orphaned sailor or a man running from something. But now her eyes lifted to Maddie's face. Now I think he was someone connected to that wreck. Maddie's breath caught. The Merrick shipwreck. The North Star. Nora stared at her in confusion, and Maddie realized her mother knew nothing of the coordinates Caleb discovered. But there would be time for that later. For now, Nora had opened the first door, the one Maddie had been trying to reach for years. You deserved to know, Nora whispered, but I was afraid the truth would bring more questions than answers. Maddie squeezed her mother's hand. It already has. Across Windermere, the Merrick estate stood like an ancient sentinel overlooking the restless tides. Inside its west wing, Evan Merrick moved through the family archive room, the golden compass still heavy against his chest. The words from the ledger replayed in his mind, given to Captain Elias Merrick and his son only. One lost at sea. He reached a tall iron cabinet filled with sealed boxes, labeled with the initials of previous Merrick patriarchs. His father, Robert Merrick II, had always discouraged him from digging into these archives, insisting they were dusty memories, not business assets. Evan had obeyed for years, but last night something shifted. The waitress's words had clawed at him all night. He pulled out a deep navy box marked R.M. Dacion, Personal Correspondence. Inside were letters many yellowed with time. As he shuffled through them, one envelope caught his eye. Brittle edges, ink-smudged, sealed with an old maritime crest. He opened it carefully. The paper crackled the handwriting unmistakably, his father's elegant, commanding, and precise. If the second compass appears, the heir we lost may return. Evan's pulse stopped, then thundered violently. Lost heir, not lost compass, not lost sailor, lost heir. He read the sentence again and again, feeling the ground tilt beneath him. His father had known. His father had hidden it. And the word heir could only mean one thing. A child of the Merrick line, had vanished. Evan pressed the letter to the table, gripping its edges as a hollow realization bloomed inside him. His entire life he had been raised as the sole successor, the future head of the Merrick Empire. But if the letter was true, he wasn't the only heir. His father had concealed a missing child, a missing future, a missing destiny. Evan felt something he hadn't felt in years, fear tinged with awe, threaded with anger. And into that swirl of emotion came one name, Madison Clark, the waitress whose mother held a compass that should not exist. He whispered to the empty room, "What did my family do?" Windermere's coastline looked almost otherworldly the next morning, wrapped in cold mist rolling in slow curtains over the dark rocks. The tide pulsed against the shore with a steady rhythmic force, as if the sea itself were trying to speak a language too ancient for human ears. Maddie Clark stood on the bluff overlooking the waves, the two golden compasses warm in her grip. After the revelations of the previous night, she felt as if the world beneath her feet had cracked open, and she was only now learning how deep the fault line truly went. Beside her, Caleb Morgan adjusted the strap of his rescue pack. He looked steady as ever, with his wind-tousled blonde hair and broad shoulders outlined against the pale sky. Caleb had always been grounded emotionally and physically, the type of man who moved through crises with a calm built from years of watching unpredictable seas. But now even he looked shaken by the mounting evidence surrounding the compass and the shipwreck. They weren't alone today. Maddie's mother Nora stood a few steps behind them, leaning slightly on a metal walking cane. Nora looked weaker than she had yesterday. The shock of confronting the truth had left her pale and trembling. Her thin frame was wrapped in a soft gray coat, and her hair, braided with strands of silver, hung over her shoulder like a quiet shadow. Nora's face held a mixture of fear and resolve, her eyes fixed on the compasses as if they were ghosts she had spent her whole life trying to forget. And then there was Grace Merrick. Grace stood slightly apart, her gloved hands clasped nervously in front of her. At 15 years old, she was tall for her age, slender with long dark hair that curled at the ends and bright hazel eyes that missed nothing. Grace had the unmistakable Merrick sharpness in her features, high cheekbones, a determined chin, but there was a softness in her expression that set her apart from the family she belonged to. She hated secrets, hated the suffocating control of the Merrick patriarchs, and when she overheard Evan's discovery about the missing heir, she slipped out of the estate with a small backpack and a determination that outshone her fear. She had come straight to Maddie with whispered urgency, saying, "I can help. I know where some of the old stuff is kept, stuff my family doesn't want anyone touching." Now the four of them stood together, drawn by the compasses and the unanswered questions tethered to them. Maddie lifted one of the compasses, the symbols etched inside this one. "You said you recognized something?" Grace nodded, stepping closer. "My father taught me to read old maritime codes when I was little, before he got sick." Her voice faltered. Grace's father, Evan, and Grace's dad had been a strict, distant man whose rigid expectations had shaped both of his children differently. Evan grew colder, more guarded. Grace grew sharper, but hungrier for truth. She swallowed and continued. "There's a marking here. It's a coordinate cipher, but not like the one you found earlier. It leads to a place on land." Caleb leaned in. Where Grace pointed toward the northern tip of the coastline, a stretch of rocky shore few people visited. The storage bunker, old Merrick cargo. She hesitated. My grandfather kept things there he didn't want archived, things he didn't want recorded anywhere. Maddie felt a chill. "We're going." The path to the northern cliffs was narrow and muddy, but the group pushed forward, guided by Grace's memory. Nora walked slowly, leaning on Caleb when the ground grew uneven, but she refused to stay behind. "If this is tied to my past," she whispered once when Maddie offered to turn back, "then it's tied to you. I won't hide any more." After nearly 30 minutes of walking, they reached a hidden alcove carved into the cliffside. A rusted metal door stood half buried behind thorny shrubs, the Merrick crest barely visible beneath decades of salt corrosion. Grace retrieved a small pry tool from her backpack. She carried it because she often escaped to forgotten parts of the estate to read or draw. Together, she and Caleb forced the old lock until it snapped with an echo that seemed to stir the very air. The bunker smelled of old wood, dried salt, and time. Light streamed in through narrow slits in the rock, illuminating stacks of weathered crates, coils of nautical rope, and bundles of old maps. Dust motes drifted like drifting stars in the stillness. Caleb lifted a lantern from the shelf and switched it on, lighting the room with warm amber glow. "Look," Grace whispered, pointing to a wooden chest pushed against the wall. It was marked with a faded label, "E.M. Captain's Private Log." Maddie's pulse quickened. They moved the chest into the open space and unlatched it. Inside were journals, dozens of them, bound in leather worn soft by age. Maddie lifted the first one, her fingers trembling. The cover read, "Captain Elias Merrick, Personal Journal." She opened it carefully. The pages crackled, the ink faded, but legible. The first entry they found was dated 42 years earlier, "My two sons. How different they are, yet how fiercely I love them both. The eldest, curious and brave, is drawn to the sea, as if born from it. The younger carries the mind of a leader. I crafted 2 compasses today, one for the heir who will guide our name, one for the heir who will guide our soul." Maddie's breath caught. 2 sons. Nora placed a trembling hand on her daughter's shoulder. Caleb read aloud from the next entry. A storm has taken what I loved most. My firstborn son swept from the deck, lost to the dark waves. But I cling to whispers from the surviving crew, a child seen drifting toward the rocks. Rescued, perhaps? The sea does not always destroy. Sometimes she returns what she claims. Grace's eyes widened. He thought the boy survived. Maddie swallowed hard, her throat tight. They continued reading, flipping through entries written in heartbreak, hope, and desperation. Then came the final entry referencing the compasses. If fate is merciful, the two compasses shall find each other again. And when they do, the bloodline I feared lost will rise from the tide. The room seemed to pulse with silence. Nora's breath shook as she whispered, "Maddie, the sailor who saved me, he might have been the eldest son," Maddie finished hoarsely. "The missing heir and your savior." Caleb exhaled. "Which means—" Maddie closed her eyes. The truth hit with full force. "My mother was rescued by the lost son of Captain Elias Merrick, and he gave her the compass." Her voice trembled. "Mom, that means he was your father, my grandfather, and he was the rightful heir." Grace stared at Maddie, stunned. "That means you're the bloodline Captain Elias was waiting for." For a moment the waves outside roared louder, as if the sea itself reacted to the revelation. Nora pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling. "He saved me, and I never knew who he was." Maddie held her mother close, the truth finally rising to the surface just as the sailor had promised. Dawn broke slowly over Windmere, painting the horizon in soft layers of apricot and pale gold. The ocean, which had roared with ancient fury just days before, now stretched in perfect stillness, as if the sea itself paused to witness the final steps of a truth long buried. The wind was gentle, brushing over the cliffs with the faint scent of salt and wet stone. Maddie Clark stood on the shore, where the waves kissed the sand, her coat wrapped tightly around her as the cold seeped through the early morning air. She looked tired, yes, but there was something new in her posture. A quiet strength, a sense of belonging she had never allowed herself to feel until now. In her hands she held the two golden compasses, their surfaces glowing faintly in the soft light. Footsteps crunched across the pebbles behind her. She turned. Evan Merrick approached, dressed in a dark wool coat that flapped lightly in the wind. He looked different from the stern man who had walked into the diner nights ago, less guarded, more human. His steel-blue eyes were softer, weighed down with regret, but also lit with resolve. Evan was tall and fit, carrying himself with the confidence of a man used to command, but this morning his steps were slower, humbled by the truth he had discovered in the archives of his family. He stopped a few feet from Maddie, the wind tugging gently at his hair. "Maddie," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but the apology already lived in the way he looked at her. "I owe you more than an explanation. I owe you an apology." He took a breath, the morning light catching on the faint sadness etched across his features. "I doubted you. I dismissed you. Not because I thought you were lying, but because it was easier than believing my family could hide something so enormous." His voice lowered. "I was wrong." Maddie exhaled softly. "You were protecting what you thought was the truth." Evan's eyes met hers, earnest and unwavering. "Maybe, but the truth wasn't mine to protect anymore." Just behind them, Grace Merrick watched silently. She stood near a driftwood log, hugging her arms across her chest. Grace's long, dark hair fluttered in the breeze, her hazel eyes shimmering with a mixture of relief and emotion. The teenager had always longed for honesty, something rare in the Merrick lineage, and seeing Maddie and Evan standing together, now facing the dawn as equals, brought tears she tried to blink away. Maddie held out her hands. Here she whispered. She offered both compasses, the one she had grown up with and the one Evan had worn since childhood. They shone like twin suns as she placed them carefully into Evan's palms. He stared at them, overwhelmed. "They were always meant to be together," Maddie said. Captain Elias made two for a reason. Evan closed his fingers around them gently, almost reverently. "And fate returned them through you." A silence fell between them, soft as morning mist, before the crunch of footsteps drew their attention. A man in a Navy windbreaker approached cautiously, carrying a manila envelope. He was Dr. Samuel Porter, a geneticist from Portland, whom Evan had called 2 days earlier. Dr. Porter was in his early 50s, with graying brown hair, round glasses that slid down his nose, and a mild, patient demeanor. He had an easy smile, the kind that suggested he spent years reassuring anxious families about medical results. His steps were careful on the uneven sand. "Mr. Merrick," he called gently. Evan nodded and walked toward him. Dr. Porter handed him the envelope. "The results are conclusive." No ambiguity. Evan opened the envelope, scanned the top page, and closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he walked back to Maddie. "Your family," he said softly. "Maddie, you are the granddaughter of the missing Merrick heir. Captain Elias's firstborn son was your grandfather, the sailor who saved your mother." Nora, who stood a few steps away, with Caleb's steady support, brought a hand to her mouth. Tears brimmed instantly. Maddie felt the ground shift beneath her, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of belonging, the answer to questions she had carried her whole life. Caleb Morgan stood behind her, tall and calm as always. The sunlight caught the blonde strands in his hair, and his green eyes held quiet pride. Caleb was a man whose strength did not come from loud declarations, but from the simple, unwavering consistency of showing up. When Maddie's breath hitched, he stepped closer, letting his presence steady her. Evan continued gently, "There's more." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folder. "I want you on the board of the Windmere Maritime Foundation as co-chair." Maddie blinked. "Evan, I'm a waitress?" "You're the granddaughter of the rightful heir," Evan said softly. "Your family suffered because mine hid the truth. This foundation will support shipwreck survivors, sailors, and families affected by the sea. It needs someone who understands what loss feels like, someone who's lived it." He held out the folder. "I want that someone to be you." Nora stepped forward, her cane sinking slightly into the wet sand. "This foundation, would it help with community medical support?" she asked quietly, the question trembling with hope she dared not hold. Evan nodded. "It already has funding allocated, starting with your treatment, Mrs. Clark." Nora's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were warm. Tears of relief, long overdue. Maddie looked at Caleb, who gave her a nod of encouragement, his familiar half-smile gentler than the sunlight. He wasn't trying to claim a place in this new world. He simply stood beside her exactly where she needed him. Their relationship had been slow burning, built on friendship and shared storms, and now it glowed with a new warmth, steady, patient kind. Evan lifted the compasses again. "There's one last thing." The group walked to the Merrick Maritime Museum, a modest but dignified stone building overlooking the harbor. Inside, in a quiet gallery of artifacts and ship models, stood an empty glass display case with a brass plaque waiting beneath it. Evan unlocked the case. Maddie placed her compass first. He set his beside it. 2 golden compasses, identical, resting side by side for the first time since they were forged, united across generations, pain, and distance. The plaque read, "The twin compasses, a promise. Fulfilled." Grace wiped her eyes. Nora squeezed her daughter's hand. Caleb rested a reassuring palm on Maddie's back. And Maddie stared at the compasses, the legacy she never sought, yet somehow inherited, and felt something gentle rise inside her. Peace. Outside, the sea was calm, The tide glimmered beneath the soft morning light, no longer a force of destruction, but a witness to healing. The Merrick family, once fractured by secrets and loss, stood quietly around her, slowly stitching itself back together, all because a humble waitress had dared to ask a question that changed everything. The Heir of the Tide had finally returned home. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come in flashes of lightning or grand signs from the heavens. Sometimes they arrive quietly, like a compass passed from one generation to another, or a truth rising slowly from the tide. Maddie's journey reminds us that even when life feels uncertain, God can weave together the broken pieces into something whole and meaningful. What was lost can be found. What was hidden can be revealed. And what was wounded can be healed. In our own everyday lives, we often walk through storms that feel too heavy to bear. But just as the sea calmed for Maddie and the Merrick family, God has a way of calming the storms within us when we choose courage, honesty, and kindness. The same God who brought the lost heir home in this story can bring restoration, hope, and purpose into our lives as well. If this story touched your heart or reminded you that God still works in quiet miracles, please share this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and redemption. May God bless every person watching, may He guide your steps, and may His peace be upon your home. If you believe in the power of truth healing and God's grace, comment Amen below.